Is there any question from the floor, please?
I'm KC from the Open University of Hong Kong. Perhaps I start with a very simple one. In the last few years, we have learned from this workshop that teaching relief is something special for this sector, and the assessment panel will be very sympathetic with our situation. In fact, for self-financing institution, people who know our situation knows that our academics are very heavily involved in teaching. Teaching relief is something really very important, essential for our work, for our involvement in research. But we have learned that this year, there have been quite a number of applications. The application for teaching relief have not been approved. Quite a number of colleagues express some sort of frustration. So we'd like to see whether there is any change in the policy, and I once again very much wish that the assessment panel can be really very sympathetic with the genuine situation of the self-financing institution. Our academics are very heavily involved in teaching, so teaching relief is really necessary for us.
So thank you. I think that the teaching relief is something that we do also for the UGC sector. It's not only for the self-financing degree sector. I think in most humanities and social sciences, they also the work does not involve students, and therefore using the time, the faculty's time, is very important. Now, I think coming back to say whether the review panel limits the request for relief teachers, I think that you have to go back and say, have you justified fully the need for the relief teachers? Meaning that what do you do with the time, and how do you use the time to do the research? And as you have heard in the first sharing session, that it is very important that you discuss and identify the needs of the relief time. How do you use the relief time to do more research? So this is the part that is, I would suggest that you go back and look at the time. If you just say, I want to get relief for 2 courses, that may not fly too well. So you need to justify the need.
Just to add to that, actually, in the assessment panel, we're very aware. We're very aware of the heavy teaching load of this sector, and in fact, we're very sympathetic of teaching relief. It is according to my recollection, we try to give as much teaching relief as possible. That has been the general practice. Now, I'm not quite sure why there might be a sentiment that have interpreted otherwise, but I would say if we are trying to do some fact checking, if the PI has asked for teaching relief and it is a successful proposal, we try to provide the teaching relief. Now, there are constraints on the teaching relief in the sense that there is a 50%, the teaching load, the teaching relief granted must stay within 50%. So we cannot have a colleague who has so much teaching relief that he or she doesn't have to teach. And also there are certain, the amount of teaching relief that is proposed needs to be well justified. I can recall that there might be cases where I think it was felt by the reviewers that the work that is proposed may not be sufficiently done at a quality that is expected according to the proposal if it is just delegated to a research assistant or some other personnel in the proposed manpower. There might be research work that needs to be personally undertaken by the PI because of the level of knowledge that is needed. In which case, there we might have some considerations on the teaching relief that is granted. So here I'd like to open up in case my fellow panel members would like to make a comment. Thank you for the question.
Is there any other question?
Thanks very much for the detailed explanation for the assessment process of the FDS. And on the other hand, what is the assessment process for the IDS, including RIG and CRG? You have mentioned that there is some difference, but any specific difference between the assessment in FDS and IDS?
So in the IDS, which there are two parts. There is the research infrastructure and also the collaboration. We also have comments coming from the reviewers, but we also have interviews. Okay, so the interview actually plays a very important part in terms of whether eventually a project is funded or not. Because sometimes we have seen that on paper, a proposal, a project looks quite good. So it actually makes it into the interview. But that at the interview, the assessment panel members will ask all kinds of questions relating to different parts of the proposal. And also there is an opportunity for the panel members and the proposers to have an exchange in terms of whether they think, whether there are points that are unclear in the proposal and how, the implementation plan, some details or some critical details of the implementation plan, justification of expenditure. So those things actually come up in the interview. And sometimes the interviews may turn a decision around, either way, from negative to positive or from positive to negative. So that is a key difference.
Thank you. We heard a very eloquent presentation at the start of the workshop today from a colleague in one of the self-financed institute, from somebody who made a resubmission of his grant. And it was clear from the reviewer's comments, or at least it appeared to be clear, that many of the reviewers of the resubmission were reviewers of the original submission. So my question to the panel is, if one is making a resubmission, do you guarantee that the proposal goes to the same reviewers as the original submission?
Yeah, thank you for the question. There is effort devoted to try to get the same set of reviewers for a resubmission. However, it is not possible to guarantee it because sometimes, especially because the reviewers, they are invited. Many of them are volunteers. They might actually have their own time constraints. We invite external reviewers, and some people say, oh, some years they do a lot, and then maybe the following year they might need to have a lighter workload, and maybe some other years they might say, oh, I can't do it this year. So it is hard to guarantee it. But one thing that we can say is actually with the subject panel and also the selected readers' input, and also we do have a big pool of potential external reviewers, we try to match up with the relevant expertise as much as possible when we look for external reviewers for a proposal. But we cannot guarantee that. Yes, thank you. So may I also add, I want to add one more point. Even if there is not an absolute guarantee, the previous, as you can see the form, right? The PI is invited to talk about, if it is a resubmission, what were the key comments and how those were addressed in the current proposal. So in fact, as I say, I want to bring forth this notion. I think writing a proposal, personally, it's one of convincing I actually write proposals every year, and I always feel that it's my job to convince the agency or the reviewers to give me funding for what I want to do. So I think if you try to elaborate on, what was the previous proposal about and what kind of comments were addressed, were given and how they were addressed in the current revised proposal. I think in general, my recollection is our panel actually looks through this and feels that if reasonable effort has been dedicated to sufficiently address the previous set of comments, the revised proposal is looked upon favorably. Yeah, thank you.
Actually, I'd like to add to that. I saw some comments from a submission saying that the success rate for the collaborative grant is low. And I think that was one comment that in terms of getting successes this is the first time that it was offered. Now, our past experience with the RGC is that for those major grants, like the collaborative research grants, the TRS and the AOE, usually that takes multiple submissions in terms of refining the proposal. I think as Professor Mang has mentioned, that it takes an interview and there may be some hiccups in the first interview or the first proposal. You try to improve it in the second round, and because the CRF grant that you are getting ranges between $2 million to $10 million. So as a result, usually one has to go through this multiple rounds to refine it in order to better convince the reviewers. So if you don't see the success rate this time is low, don't be discouraged because it would get higher. It just takes multiple rounds.
I found that there are the major changes of the new form is that the objectives and the impacts of a statement has increased from 2 pages to 4 pages. And can you advise what is the rationale behind what do you want us to write more? And also for the pathways of the impact statement, it emphasized much on the economic and social impact, but as I'm a researcher of the Chinese literature, so like such kind of humanities subjects, what can we write in these 2 pages? Can you talk about more? Thanks.
Research impact statement is something we have introduced this time for all the RGC grants, not only for the self-financing degree sector. We started with the RIF, Research Impact Fund, that we funded a year ago. But starting in this exercise, we are now making a requirement for all RGC grants, except for travel grants or conference grants, that we would ask them, the PIs, to submit a pathway to impact statement. Now, you said that it may be difficult for humanities to write a pathway to impact. In fact, we are now, the impact case studies is now required for all UGC institutions to submit the impact case studies in the research assessment exercise this year. So this is not something only for science, engineering, but also applies to humanities and social sciences. Now, the pathway to impact doesn't mean that you can describe the pathway in different ways, meaning that different disciplines would see different impact. The impacts may not be economical impact, may not be societal impact, but it may, for example, impact a policy, changes the policy, changes the way that people look at a problem, that you have to identify in your specific area, what do you consider as important in your discipline? Now, of course, in every discipline, there is impact. It doesn't mean that they do not translate into citations. Citation is a measure of, is a quantitative measure of academic impact, but not societal impact or impact at large. So therefore, you have to look at, even for a novel, it may have a long-term impact. It may change the way that people look at certain aspects in the literature. So those are the things that you need to describe specific to your area. So I think that that's our experience in terms of like looking at the studies that have been done in the UK. In 2014, when when academics were first required to write impact statement, they were very much against it. But after the exercise in 2014, nearly all the institutions now said they value an opportunity to articulate the impact of each research area. So this is something that people have found it useful, because if you have not been asked to think about impact, you may take it for granted. You may think that this is always going to happen. But I think now, for when you're writing the research, we are not asking you to say exactly after 10 years what is going to happen to your research work. But we are asking, like, how do you articulate the pathway, meaning that what is the process using, starting from the initial research, leading to the end, and at the end, it would create something important for society, that you have to write something to describe that process. So in a way, you can say that, you can think that it forces you to think deeper in terms of why are you doing this research? It's not just to writing a paper. Of course, writing a paper, as mentioned by Professor Ding in the beginning, is important. You write the title of your papers, but you need to go beyond the titles of your papers. You need to say, beyond the papers, what are you going to do? How is that going to affect society at large in multiple years?
Is there any question? This one, please.
Tracy Kwan from the I Research Office. Thank you for the very helpful presentations. My question is about how to prepare for FDS proposals budget. Am I too soft? Okay. Should I rephrase? Okay. Because we noticed that this year, some of our supported projects, the budgets have been drastically reduced by up to 50–60%, with no explanations given. Okay, for instance, we have one supported 3-year project. The approved budget for staff, research staff, is not even enough to hire a research assistant for 1 year. So we really would like some of your advice as to how we should do our budget. Thank you.
So I think for a given proposal, the research plan and methodology is the key to how you should shape your budget. So without going into the micro level in a particular proposal, because we should not be looking at discussing a particular proposal here. In general, the reviewers actually look at the approach that is put forward, the manpower that is needed, the equipment that is needed, maybe some other general expenses or consumables. Essentially, the budget items that have been laid out in the table of the proposal. So again, I think the budget needs to fit well to the research plan, and also, I mean, even if you talk about a research assistant, whether sometimes when I write my own proposals, I need to consider whether it is work that I can teach a PhD student to do, or I can teach a master's student to do, or I can ask, or I can hire a research assistant to do it. Or sometimes I must say, I actually have to do it myself, right? So in which case, if it's work that I do myself, then I don't ask for a research assistant. If it's work I think a master's student cannot do it, then I have to propose enough funding so I can support a PhD student. Again, I think it's really the research plan, which is based on the research methodology. So the methodology that is put forward and the plan needs to give a good correspondence to the items that are presented in the budget.
Let me add to that. I think that the budget, the money that you get, is also related to the review outcomes. Meaning that, for example, a project rated as 5 would normally get fully funded. However, a project getting a 4 may not. The reason is that when the readers or the reviewers look at the readers looking at the project rated as 4, there may be weaknesses in the project. And for those weaknesses, they may feel that that part of the work may not need to be carried out because there are weaknesses that cannot be overcome. As a result, therefore, there may be some cut in in your budget so that only the important part of the work will be carried out. So this is in a sense that it is related to the scoring, to the score that you get in the project. If you see a project with 5, you would rarely see any cut in the budget because it is so good that everybody rated it as top-notch. It must be fully funded. And that is usually, no matter how much you are asking, unless you are asking like for $10 million for an FDS, it will not get funded. But if you're asking something within reason and you get a top-rated project, it would get funded.
I guess referring to the question you just asked, and I cannot comment on specific cases because I do not know exactly what proposals you're referring to. But I have seen some cases in which that might be leading to a RA being cut. Is that if you ask for something, you have to have a justification. And so in cases that the justification is not well written, to the point that the panel members are not convinced why you need the RA, and then if you're not getting a 5.0, then the chances are the RA might be cut partially or completely. There are also some special cases that, of course, I do not know whether it applies to your institution or not. I have seen justifications and budgets from the same institution. There are more than one that are almost identical in asking for the number of RAs and so on and so forth. And these different proposals are doing different things. And one of the PI is a very senior researcher, and the others are younger ones. And so sometimes when a panel member sees something like that, they are wondering why would a more senior member and the junior members ask for exactly the same support. And the justification is almost identical. Now, I guess I can understand maybe the younger members of the faculty may ask the senior member, may I take a look at the proposal, and then they may just make some reference and, oh, okay, you write something nice and I will just use it. But if it comes to the panel, then the panel will say that why would two people ask for the same resources? And if you're running the research office of the institution, you may want to take a look to make sure that those things won't happen. Otherwise, it goes to the panel, then the panel will look very carefully to see why, this kind of thing happens. Now, another possibility that an RA might be cut is that you have to think in the shoes of the panel member. Now, for FDS, the purpose is to support development of researcher, right? So the point is that the panel wants to give the PI some money so that he or she can do some research. And then you say that, well, need to do a lot of teaching, and therefore you ask for teaching relief. And in fact, I'm surprised that the gentleman who said that teaching relief is cut. But I think to the best of our knowledge, it is seldom cut. And it is usually very generously provided. So I guess maybe the RGC staff can do some fact checking to see why and under what circumstances will the teaching relief be cut. But there is a possibility that maybe the researcher from the institution is asking for teaching relief and also a lot of RA support. So if the panel member decides to give a lot of support for the RA, then we say that, well, maybe you don't need that much teaching relief. That is one possibility. I'm just finding a rationalization of what has happened. But some fact checking need to be done. But usually, if you put two things on the table, asking for money, one is teaching relief versus you ask for an RA, I can bet that in most of the circumstances, the panel member would try to give you the maximum teaching relief allowable, because the purpose, as far as the panel is concerned for FDS, is to enable and the young researcher to develop the teaching skill, not for you to hire somebody else to publish paper for your institution. And so we put two things on the table, teaching relief versus RA. I bet 98% is that the panel will give you whatever you ask for the teaching relief, independent of whether you get a 4.0, 4.5, or 5.0, okay? I can pretty assure you that it has been happening. If the teaching relief is not granted, it must be for some special reasons that some fact checking need to be done. But an RA is really not so guaranteed, in particular if you're already asking for teaching relief. And the purpose of the FDS is not really for in particular for young people, to hire somebody else to publish paper. And also, my understanding is that if you ask for a undergraduate student, I think the support is like $2,500 for 10 months. It's always granted. And so these are deemed reasonable. And if you ask for funding to go to a conference, it's not that much, but it's always granted. And if you ask for, in the case of the physical science panel, some consumables to do experiment, they're always usually granted. But RA is not so sure. Okay.
But I can probably share a secret in the panel, okay? Panel members and also our chair ladies are extremely generous and supportive with the budgets. Any major cut in the budget involved lengthy discussions at the panel meeting. That's the first thing. And second, I think I can share one example why some budgets are cut. Some RDS, especially RDS, applying for 1 million, organize one conference involving 50 audience. Okay, now you calculate the, what's the budget per person for one person attendee, okay, delegate. So in that kind of case, I think we discussed a budget cut for that kind of event, and involving 500,000 or 1 million, organizing one workshop, okay, with 50 delegates. So in the future, when you write ideas proposal, try to avoid that. That's far too expensive to run that kind of event. Okay.
Just to make some supplement for the manpower. Sometimes in the proposal, I have the other way around. Some PI may only ask teaching relief, and then they will not ask much more about the research staff support. It depends on the proposal, because some proposals are mainly maybe the documentary analysis, so that all the work will be done by the PI. Therefore, teaching relief is the most important thing. But of course, for some other proposal, there will be a lot of data collection from the field work. That means they need maybe a number of the student helpers or even for the research assistants. That means for the reviewers, particularly in the assessment panel, we will think about it, whether the manpower or the teaching relief are balanced or well justified. That means maybe from case by case, some may find that, oh, I need more teaching relief, but why you did not give me the budget? But in some other proposal, they will ask more manpower on the research assistant. But finally, the proposal was cut some of the manpower in the research assistant. That means it may be case by case considered by the assessment panel.
I'd like to raise a comment which we received saying that we were not able to spend all the money allocated for the self-financing degree sector. And the question is that why are you still cutting our budget? And so the answer here is that we are trying to fund all the qualified research. We are not trying to use up all the money. So the objective is that we fund all fundable research that are of high quality. Academic merit is the criterion that we are using to review proposals, not the funding amount. So as a result, when you write the budget in, we look at the proposal, we look at the budget and the work proposed, whether that actually correlate between the budget and the work that you are proposing is the key decision that we are making to decide how much to give to the proposal. We try to use up as much money as possible. In fact, from last year to this year, the amount funded almost doubled this year. So in a way that we are trying to be as generous as possible in terms of funding. Now, as Professor Mang has mentioned, the project up to a score of 4.0 will be funded. In fact, in the UGC or the RTC proposals, the GRF and the ECS, we don't fund proposals. Normally, we don't fund proposals at 4.0. The bar there is higher. And in fact, even when you go up to 4.5, the chance of getting funded is only about 50 to 60%. It's not guaranteed, even at 4.5. So therefore, for this self-financing sector, we are trying to be as generous as possible in funding all the qualified research that we can fund.
Any more questions?
Thank you for allowing me to share some views for a second time. I have 2 points. The first is that we do see that the arrangement for the funding schemes have got improvements in various ways. We are really grateful for that. We really appreciate it. This evening's workshop is also an improvement. We are indeed grateful that the chair of RGC, the assessment panel chair, together with several subject panel members have come to share their views with us. We do appreciate it. We really hope that this will continue so that we have more dialogue, we share views together. At least that is a chance every year. My next question is, once again, as the important people are here, I'd like to raise one point about the policy of the CRG, Collaborative Research Grant. Now, the co-PIs are also given teaching relief. This is an improvement. But colleagues here have been raising upon that the co-PIs may also need conference grant. Now the conference grant is given to the PC only, the project coordinator only. I know the answer. The Secretariat has correctly conveyed the policy of the Council that the UGC sector is the same. The GLF is the same, so it is not unfair to us. It is the practice. But we very much hope that as the co-PI's teaching relief has been granted, this can also, the conference grant can also be reviewed. Thank you very much.
I think that what you mentioned, you mix up two things. For the GRF, for the co-Is, they don't get conference grants for GRF. However, for CRF, the collaborative research grant, they are bigger grants between $2 to $10 million. You can get conference grants for the co-PIs. That is, they are not, I think that if not, then we are going to look at the policy because they are major grants that involve multiple collaborations. For the FDS and the GRF, the co-PIs or the co-Is do not get conference grants. I think that's the policy we are making. So I think you're confusing the two. CRF in the IDS is not the same as GRF in the UGC sector.
I think you did not apply for conference grant for co-PI in your proposal. That's why you don't get it. I think there's no policy restricting that, but it's all written in the proposal. If you didn't apply, you don't get it. That's as simple as that.
And normally co-Is in the FDS do not normally get money. Most of the money goes to the PIs, and the co-Is are not are there to put the names in. So in a way that for FDS, they are more for individual grants. But for CRF, the collaborative grants, they are major grants that involve $2 to $10 million. So it is inconceivable that we only give $20,000 of conference grant to the PI and nothing else to all the co-Is. How would you be able to use up $10 million if you're not doing that?
Maybe the Secretariat can clarify. My understanding is suppose that the PI shares some of the resources with the co-PI. The co-PI can use that amount of money to go to conferences. Am I correct? No. My understanding is that the PI have some money which is dedicated for doing traveling to go to conferences. But you can use more. Yeah, but
no, not FDS. The FDS is an individual grant. Money doesn't go to the co-Is.
Maybe the Secretariat can clarify that point.
Yeah. So for the CRF, when you write the proposal, you need to justify how many conferences that you want to go to, perhaps even naming the conferences, and then in the description you can state who are going to the conferences, the PI or the co-PIs. I think the reviewers are going to look at that with more information provided in the budget. Don't just give a lump sum and say I want to go to 10 conferences. Then most likely they will be cut.
May I clarify? The ideas of collaborative research grant is modeled on the collaborative research fund of the UGC sector, and mode of operation of the two schemes is the same. And for the CRF in the UGC sector, the indicative figure for the conference grant is 20,000 per year per project. So for GLC, for collaborative research grant, our indicative figure is also 20,000 per year per project.
Well, I think that we would look at that question more closely. I think that requires more discussion, and it cannot be answered at this point. Okay.
If there is any other questions?
Well, if there are no questions, there is in fact some information that may be useful for writing the pathway to impact. In fact, that has been the case in UK for quite a few years. So if you go to the internet, you just type how to write a pathway to impact statement. You are going to see many examples from different institutions in the United Kingdom telling you how to write, including how to write for poets. I don't think they have any instruction to help you how to write for Chinese literature, but I think they do have some to tell you how to write for English literature. So this will not be that different. So that may be a useful, kind of resources that you can use.
If there is no more question, I would like to thank Professor Wah, Professor Mann, and Professor Chan, Professor Kwon, and Professor Sin for your valuable advice.